In this episode, I talk with interdisciplinary artist Teresa Flores about her work. This episode also features student work from the printmaking class of Nicholas Spohrer, so a huge thank you and shout out to Nick and his printmaking students for providing us with these images of their amazing monotype and woodcut prints. These are all made at home using tools they have lying around, like the back of a spoon is what I've heard is the main tool that's used to make these prints, and I just think that's amazing. So thank you for sharing them with us, and I hope you enjoy the show. Teresa, what was it like to grow up in Fresno? How has it influenced the way that you make art and think about making art?
Growing up in Fresno, I mean, there was always really cool kind of synchronicities, I guess, with growing up in Fresno and what I saw in like pop culture and my childhood. And so it just seemed like this natural thing. Like I was a child in Fresno and there was like a TV show on in the 80s called Fresno. And it was like, well, of course, I'm a kid. This just seems normal, My grandmother worked at this place called the Fresno Learning Center. I know I've told you about that before, but that place really was formative for me, being a kid. So it was called the Fresno Learning Center. It was in the Maston Towers in downtown Fresno, just like right off of the Fulton Mall. And she was like an administrative assistant, or I'm not sure, she was called a secretary back then. But it was this senior citizen center where the ladies from the neighborhood, like Maston Towers that lived in Fulton Mall area and like Kearney Park area, all of that would gather and they would like make crafts and paint and chisme and share food and quilt and build ceramics, and they just had all these awesome things that they did together there. And as a kid, I would sit there and watch them, but then sometimes they would teach me things. Like they taught me how to macrame and like build ceramics. And so that was just kind of like, oh, this is just what we do. This is what people do. People can like gather together around a table and like, as a senior citizen, you can just spend your day like making something or crafting something, and you can switch. You can go from like macrame to like fixing a lamp to sharing food with people. And this is just like what you do during your day.
Things that you do while being with other people that are also creative and generative.
Yeah.
And for the exhibition Thickets in 2018, we showed the quilt. This is the quilt, the quilt that was made at the Fresno Learning Center, right? Mm-hmm. The community quilt.
Yeah.
So that's yeah, I remember that piece. And quilts inherently they're such kind of often very communal projects. So growing up, that really formed the way that you think about your practice. And that makes sense because you're an interdisciplinary artist and you have these different strands that include performance and public art, but also things like you've been teaching yourself to hand letter in the kind of this, it's like sign painting style, kind of classic sign painting style of hand lettering. And of course, food with the experimental Quesadilla Lab, and more recently, snacks.
Yeah.
Snacking as an art form, which I 100% agree with. And so all these things seem there's this common thread of kind of resourcefulness and collaboration that runs through them. So could we maybe talk a little bit about how all these things feed into one another?
Yeah, I mean, I believe at some point in time they would refer to it as woman's work.
Right.
Which I later learned as a student at Fresno State. Like I spent all this time around these women, these senior citizen women as a kid, crafting and making art. And then as a student in Fresno State, I learned about Fresno's rich history with the feminist art movement.
Yeah.
And like learning what groups of women did like within the art world, and you know what was considered like art and fine art, and like blending these boundaries of the work that women do that's not necessarily always considered an art form or a practice.
But moving on to kind of performance and public art, I wanted to talk to you about the Fresno Yoga Project, which is kind of a long-running project. And I know recently you've had a different iteration leading a yoga session at LACMA in response to Rufino Tamayo's paintings.
Yeah.
I remember just seeing the Fresno Yoga poster, which has poses that relate directly to the landscape of Fresno, and that if you've spent any time here, immediately will kind of make you laugh. So within that idea of taking yoga and relating it directly to a place, there's this quite sharp critique of wellness and wellness culture, which runs through all of your work, I think. Could you just maybe talk a little bit in depth about that project and how it kind of continues?
The wellness world wasn't something that I had been interested in being part of. I was more kind of thrown into it when I was diagnosed with endometriosis in 2005. And I had to learn how to manage my symptoms and to create like an endurance for my body for the long haul, for my work and for anything that I wanted to do. And so that involved me actually like changing my lifestyle and incorporating these elements of wellness into what I do daily. And when I was very new to that, I looked around and it was like, this is a world that's built for rich white ladies, that I don't see people that look like me as part of it. And I was like, I don't even know how I can make this affordable to myself or accessible to myself, or even incorporate some of it into my daily life.
Right.
And so I had to find my own ways to do it, where I felt like I was still being true to myself and I was incorporating my culture and what was around me into my lifestyle. And that just became this kind of like macro meta kind of thing, where where I'm like, okay, I'm not the only one who's experiencing this. And like, there's 1 in 10 women who have endometriosis. It just affects you just wherever you are in this world, whatever you look like. And I'm like, okay, this is like a huge cultural issue to have to look to this wellness world to help you heal and feel like you're not part of it. And so I started incorporating that into my practice with like Fresno Yoga. Like I wanted yoga. I looked at yoga and I saw that when you look at the poses, they're based in like India and the Asian continent. And then you start looking at the other various forms of yoga, which go all the way out through Africa and the Middle East. And those are very localized to the area. And so I was like, well, what if I localize it to where the areas that I know? You know, would that make it more accessible to me? Would that make it more accessible to other people? And would we want to, would we find it easier to incorporate that wellness into our lives by like calling a pose the Black Stone or the Downward Dog, the Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, you know, like all of these poses got renamed. And I did this in collaboration with Rebecca Plevin, who she's a good friend of mine, and she's an outstanding journalist. And she has like the formal professional yoga training.
Sure.
And I'm just kind of imagining things along, and we get together and we brainstorm and we bounce around these ideas. And yeah, it's a good process together. Our body is tied to the land, like
right,
wherever we are in whatever places. And that's a lot of what yoga is about, is, you know, that spiritual experience. Like it's taking you through the course of life and death. You know, you're starting out in this child's pose and you end in corpse pose. And you know, it's that experience. It's a spiritual experience. And so I am definitely spiritually tied to the land of the Central Valley in California for many, many generations. So to incorporate that in like a daily bodily practice that is healing for me, it's pretty significant.
Yeah, I'm always struck at the end of a yoga class when you're in corpse pose, you're actually practicing dying. Yeah, and so where you are lying down, and it's about the connection very directly to the ground that you're lying on top of, you're supposed to really feel your body being supported by the ground. Mm-hmm. So where you're lying down seems important, your relationship to that ground. Yeah.
And Rebecca and I incorporated that into the Rufino Tamayo sessions at LACMA, where we ended it with his final painting was called The Violin, which was not included in the exhibit, but it was still important to me to note it at the end of the session, that this was his final work. And just the shape of the violin, and that you can lay your body flat and be this instrument also with its tune.
Tell me a little bit about how being kind of confined to home and the pandemic has shifted your practice. Something I've been thinking about is just the idea of kind of aliveness or liveness and performance online, but kind of done in people's bedrooms.
Yeah.
It's like the COVID question everyone has to ask.
Yeah, I know. I think it's important to talk about it. I definitely did not expect to like have my face or my home on camera and recorded like ever so much in my life. I don't think any of us were. And I mean, I'm interested in adapting, but I know that there's other people who are like, no, this is not for me. I don't want to be part of it. So it's been something that like when I first, like I started up doing a program called Fresno Famoso, which was broadcast on the CMAC channel up in Fresno, but also live streamed onto Facebook for like anybody to see. But when I first started doing that, I was taking like the Trevor Noah approach, and I'm like in my hoodie with my hair pulled back and like whatever. And then it clicked in my brain. I'm like, oh my God, this is like going into my archives forever. I need to put some makeup on or something. So yeah, I wasn't expecting that stuff. But for quarantine, I feel like quarantine, I kind of had this like head start in quarantine, like a 2-year head start. I mentioned earlier that like I was diagnosed with endometriosis in 2005, which is just this like weird disease. It's not going to like it's not like degenerative, and it's not going to kill you, but because there's, and it might leave you infertile, but it's such a weird disease that they don't really know a lot about. And it's so, something that you can treat holistically that I struggled with, that I didn't, realize that like a holistic treatment would actually help me the most. But one of its major symptoms is fatigue, chronic fatigue. And so in like 2017, I was just overcome with debilitating fatigue. Like making my bed was just a horrible experience. It would just knock me out for the rest of the day. I couldn't do anything. And so this quarantine experience was like, I just really couldn't leave my house. Like I had to stop working. I had to find like other ways to get support because I just couldn't do it on my own. And I had to just really take that time to figure out how to take care of myself and what to do. But in that time, it was like for 2 solid years, I just did not have the energy to make art or just to like be as present as I was. I was still active and doing what I could, but I was operating at like a very low level than I'm capable of. So as quarantine was starting up in March of this year, I had a surgery in like late December, and my body was healing up from it. And I had spoken to other women who had the same surgery, and they're like, it takes like at least 6 months before you feel normal again.
Wow.
And yeah, and so right in March, that was like the halfway point, and I started like, there was just like this shift in my energy, and I thought maybe it was just like anxiety from the quarantine or something, and maybe it was, but I suddenly had energy to do a lot of things throughout the day. And so being kind of like regulated to stay home by our government was like, oh man, this is a bummer. There's so much I can do right now. But it was like, okay, I'm home, but at least now that I'm home, I can do so much more. Yeah. So I've been able to kind of like contain my energy in ways where like now I'm like I produced a program, the Fresno Famoso show, and we got that on there. And a lot of what I've done has been so just like public, but happening at home.
Yeah. I saw a recent piece that you made for the online exhibition, which is titled Home,
Mm-hmm.
where you're dancing in your bedroom, and I think it's called Got It From My Mama.
Yeah.
And yeah, could you talk a little bit about sort of what it was like to take the plunge and perform in that way? Because yeah, it's a great video, and but there's also kind of vulnerability attached to that kind of performance. For me, there would be
so much. Yeah. So much. Yeah, I don't know if people realize it or not. Yeah, so it's called Got It From My Mama. So the concept behind the show, it's called Home, and it's based out of Acogedor Space, which is out of curator and artist Nicole Rademacher's home. So she was really curious about like, what are artists doing during quarantine? How are you handling it? What kind of art are you making? And I just got to thinking about just the practices that I had been doing. Like, in addition to just like regaining my health and diving back into my art practice, I also just look at my culture, and I look at myself. I'm like, what do I want to learn? Like, what do I want to get better at? What do I want to do? And so I've been learning Spanish, but also I started realizing that just from being at home, I wasn't dancing. And like, I wanted to move, and I felt really like, I felt this new energy in my body, and I was like, I need to dance, I need to move. Yeah. And I started doing Zumba, and I was like, God, I'm so bad at this. It's a good thing I'm like by myself and nobody can see me. But like, just the cultural ramifications of like, people kind of assume sometimes that, I've got this like brown skin, and so there must be all of this culture that's just like naturally downloaded into me, and then I'm able to like perform and act, like speaking Spanish fluently and like dancing Latin dances perfectly. And I know that I'm not the only one, again, and so I was like, I will record myself dancing to Zumba from a video that I found on YouTube, and just let all of the cultural layers and meanings that are happening with that act of me doing it be recorded and take place. Do it again. Up. B-step. Take it up for 4 like this. Grab it. Shake it back. Take it up. Shake it back. Now we're going to pop that knee.